moderating our last panel of the day. And so I'll be introducing the four panelists in just a moment. This panel is on the ongoing influence of Andrés Montoya, and we have the pleasure of hearing from four wonderful writers about that influence. And as always, there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end of the panel. Monique Quintana is a contributing editor at Luna magazine, and she blogs at her site Blood Moon about Latinx literature, and is a pop culture contributor at Clash Media. And her novella is forthcoming in 2019, and the novella is a fantastical imagining of her hometown of Fresno. And I'm just reading shortened versions of these bios. Second will be Kenneth Robert Chacón, who's a native of Fresno, received his BA from UC Davis and an MFA in poetry from Fresno State. His first collection of poetry was published last year, titled The Cholo Who Said Nothing, and he teaches at Fresno City College. And to his, no, that will be Kenneth. And then third will be Marisol Baca. Marisol is the author of Tremor, which won the 3 Mile Harbor Press Poetry Prize. And she's been nominated for a Pushcart Prize, and she lives in Fresno and teaches at Fresno City College as well. And at the end of the table there is Tim Z. Hernandez.
He needs no introduction.
Who needs no introduction? Writer, performer, artist. Of course, deep Fresno roots, and currently teaches at University of Texas, El Paso. His latest book, All They Will Call You, is incredibly powerful, and if some of you have not heard, there's some good news that I asked if I could share, and Tim said that I could, but just a few days ago, Tim signed the paperwork that All They Will Call You will be made into a film, so it's very exciting. And so with that, I'll turn it over to the panelists.
When I think of Montoya, I think of QUA. Here's the mission statement that I wrote for QUA when I was QUA president in 2014. Founded in 1991, the Chicano Writers and Artists Association is a collective of students that seeks to diversify and politicize the creative community of Fresno State and the Central Valley through literary events and projects. The other day, someone asked me how CWA was doing, and I was like, what the hell is CWA? When I finally figured out what they were talking about, I said, I prefer QUA, or La QUA. QUA as a sound made my friends think of an ugly gothic bird. So we made a crow our mascot. We had a QUA crow. We figured this would be our great contribution to the legacy of QUA. One spring, QUA hosted a Rogue Festival reading, and we invited students from our MFA's other student organization to read with us. At the time, the student organization was run by all the popular white hipster kids in the program. And to be all subversive and political, we put the QUA crow in a newsboy cap on the event flyer, but then remembered that most brown poets around here wear newsboy caps too. That was an unfortunate accident. That was the QUA event that was most attended by people from our program. We sold out tickets, and the Rogue Festival gave us an award for this. Now, we genuinely did like and respect that student group and the hard work they did. We also knew about the politics of hipster oligarchies and student organizing. We knew that inviting the popular white kids would bring a lot of people out, and they would buy tickets. We kept all the money for QUA because we really wanted some kind of catering for our next event, and Fresno State charges like $50 for chips and salsa. But really, with each event that we did, we began to recognize who was supporting our events and projects and who wasn't supporting them. I say support, of course, because we can still support students from afar. We can't possibly show up to every event and help out with every project. Some of us live in a different city. Sometimes we're legit sick with a fever. Sometimes we just don't have the heart to leave our homes or even get out of bed, and that has to be okay. The thing to think about is who you'll support and why, and specifically how you'll do it. The way we support student-run organizations is a reflection of our community. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about Qua in some way. Sometimes an old embarrassing photo will pass through my feed, or I'll accidentally open an old Qua file from my computer. Yesterday, I argued with one of my best friends, JJ Hernandez, via text message about some old unresolved Qua politics, and I was like, damn, this shit is way too deep. I learned from Qua that brown rider people can seem like contradictions. It was hard for us to brag about our Qua accomplishments. Our parents and grandparents raised us to be modest and have a humility, and compared to what we went through, who are we riders to think we are so important anyway? But really, I have no problem bragging about how amazing I think I am when I'm drinking with my best friends at Bobby Salazar's. But it unnerves me to do it out in the open. I still get embarrassed every time I share something about my writing on social media, and that's something I need to work on because we need to be proactive about increasing our visibility. In the spring of 2015, Qua was able to secure $7,500 from IRA funding to go to AWP conference in Minneapolis. We ran around giving grants to all our brown friends in the English department. Everyone called me Qua Oprah, and I have never felt more powerful in my entire life. Now, it was our intention to spam the Qua Facebook feed with "look at us" pictures of us at the conference with famous writers and at drinking at microbreweries and riding roller coasters at the Mall of America. But we never got around to doing this because we would always slip into our modesty and our humility. We seem like contradictions because most Qua people end up becoming abrasive and outspoken. Sometimes we make people uncomfortable when we speak. Sometimes we're not the best at diplomacy. I still ask myself, how can I be outspoken and do it with integrity? BC, before Qua, I always wanted people to think I was a nice girl, even though I knew I really wasn't. Nowadays, I don't want people to think of me as a nice woman because that would mean I'm not really interested in making things better. But it's not easy to be outspoken. Some students put their reputations and their personal wellness on the line to criticize the inequities they see in their institutions. This isn't an easy thing for them to do. Sometimes I miss the late night text messages, the passing back and forth of digital files, the bar food, the zigzagging across campus on my lunch break, lugging around mics and speakers, hoping it won't rain, even though I shouldn't hope that. I know I shouldn't hope that. This fall, my 15-year-old son ran around Fresno High trying to join Mecha, only to find out that it was defunct there. When I asked him why he didn't want to start it himself, his reply was, I don't want to do all that work. Students feel safe when they can join something that has already been set in place. It takes a few radical students to be the creators of that space, to take the risk that it might fail, that it might waver, that it might become something else. It takes a few radical students to keep things going, to regenerate things, to sort through all the valleys that are inevitable. It took me the longest time to learn that just because we can only do a small fraction of what we wanted to do, doesn't mean those intentions weren't a part of our reality. It didn't mean we weren't doing enough. A few weeks ago, I found an old shopping bag with things we used to use for Qua. There was a bright blue tablecloth, 2 happy-faced girl and boy piñatas, and a jar full of candy. There was a tattered piece of paper with notes on it. There were things we wanted to do, but never got around to doing. It said, Mi Vida Loca screening, Chacón fashion show, Brown Hamlet.
Okay, I think I'm next, and I've written some things, some thoughts. You know, Andrés has been such a huge influence in my life and in my writing, and probably more so after he's passed away. You know, with the publication of his book. And so I'm not sure. Kind of like how my brother was saying, I'm not sure if it's going to be cohesive. I might talk about butter and maybe some types of music or something like that, but I'll do my best. So I've told the story of how Andrés got me registered for college, of how he picked me up one afternoon and helped me to write an essay to join the Puente program at Fresno City College, a program that I now teach in and have for several years, a program that is near and dear to my heart. I've told the story to many people of how he took me and he wanted me to go into the bookstore, but I was packing a .32 underneath my belt, a gun, and I thought that the metal detector would snitch on me, so I refused to go into the bookstore. I told that story at AWP in Washington, D.C. the year before last. And I've told it to my creative writing classes, and I've replayed that day over and over in my head. It's a good story, and if you haven't heard it, come ask me after. But I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about Andres and his writing. You see, I've been stealing from Andrés Montoya practically my entire writing life. What was it?
Good writers borrow, great writers steal.
That must be hella good. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kenneth Chacón. I'm Daniel's brother, and I am a graduate of the Fresno State program. And as Lee said, my first book of poetry, The Cholo Who Said Nothing, was published last year. I am from Fresno, born and raised, and I adopted what the hip-hop artist Planet Asia calls a Fresno state of mind, which pretty much means at a young age I was obsessed with guns and drugs and, gang things. And my book deals plainly with these issues. As I've said before, I steal from Andres. I don't necessarily steal his words, although his language definitely shapes my language. More than anything else, I stole his faith. I stole his Jesus. I stole the God who would love you despite your flaws, despite your failures, despite your demons. That book really represented hope for me. And, it's been a big, The Ice Worker Sings has been such a huge influence in my life because of the Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And I gotta let you know, when I was younger, I did a lot of reading. My brother was woke. Andres was woke. They schooled me. I'm a little bit younger than, 13 years younger than my brother. And so I read up on the Aztecs or on the Mexica. I read up on the Spanish conquest and colonization of the Americas. And when I learned my history, the history of my people, I was pissed. It led to me favoring the idea of revolution, and I think Andres and Daniel had a lot to do with that. So I thought of like an actual revolution. And I was in little gangbanging days, but I love that idea because it's something you could do, something you could that you could do for the people, for the poor, for the people of color, for the refugee, for the migrant, for the oppressed. I love the idea of them one day inheriting the earth. But I also grew to hate Christianity and hate what Jesus represented. Blonde hair, fair skin, blue eyed. I was raised somewhat Catholic. I did never go hardly at all. I think I went to catechism twice or something like that. But I certainly inherited the guilt part. So. But I do remember going to visit Danny and Andres in Eugene, Oregon, when they were grad students there. I remember one night my brother and I, as we are prone to do, we got drunk and we had a serious disagreement. We were at Ken Casey's daughter's house. I'm not sure if you remember that. It was the first night I ever dropped acid. I didn't tell you about that, but anyway, so when we got home, my brother and I, we butted heads over a stuffed animal. I think it was named Floppy, right? And I remember the way my brother yelled at me. I was about 16 years old and, just full of anger. And I remember the heat around my neck that I felt as he yelled at me. I remember being so mad at him that I punched his dresser and one of the drawers busted. And I remember Andres. I remember Andres coming between my brother and I. He had recently become saved in a Christian sense. And he was changing little by little, just little evidences of him just becoming new, a new creation. And I knew him before his conversion. And the night that my brother and I actually got into a fight, he drank a couple of beers with us, and I think he even smoked a joint. But after my brother and I got into a conflict, I remember Andres' hands, because he had huge, gigantic hands. I think they've been referenced a couple times. I like to think of his fists as being like two uncooked turkeys. And I remember him getting between my brother and I remember what he said when he stepped between us, when he put his hands on our chest. I remember he looked at us with that look that you said earlier, that kind of puppy dog look, And he said, it's not right for brothers to be fighting. And he got convicted that night. He said, and you know what? It's not right for me to be drinking with you. I was only 16 and he felt like I needed a role model. And I remember him telling me that he was never going to drink again. And as far as I know, he never did for the rest of the time that I was there in Oregon. My brother and I drank, but he didn't ever partake. If I can speak honestly, Andrés is the reason for my book. After that summer in Oregon, he looked out for me. As I said, he got me registered at Fresno City College, and he often encouraged me to write and share my work with them. But to tell you the truth, I was too afraid to open up. I was afraid of the darkness that was inside of me, and I was afraid to share that darkness. It wasn't until I was a student at UC Davis when Andrés was dying in the hospital that I started to write poetry regularly. I've always felt bad because I never got a chance to visit him before he passed away. I was going through my own issues, and before I even got a chance to visit, he was gone. His book was the reason I started writing poetry, and eventually applied to the creative writing program here at Fresno State, where I met Connie and Chuck, and fantastic writers who have been nothing but supportive. But I was amazed by the power of Andrés' words. And it's funny because he had this beauty. He had beauty, but it was paired up against an ugly meth pipe. He wrote about graffiti on bus 30 and Lion, who I actually knew at the time, who spray painted and graffitied everywhere. He wrote about gunshots and lovers in Radio Park. I felt like he was writing my life. For years, I rejected Christianity. I rejected Jesus. I rejected hope, choosing darkness and depression as a form of self-flagellation for my sins. These were the years that I participated in the most self-destructive behavior. And anyone who knows me knows that I'm a little crazy. That, basically I'm a little wild at heart, and I've got two sides to myself. And it's always been the case that one side's trying to kill the other. And I think about it, all throughout my life, I've been looking for like some freedom. And while his book, The Ice Worker Sings, certainly deals with darkness, with the shadowy alley, with the dimly lit hotel room, with the silence and in the aftermath of a gunshot, it also speaks plainly of hope. Andrés remembered the immigrant. He remembered the refugee. He remembered the prostitute, the addict, the gangbanger. The hope that I found in Andrés' poetry made me want to believe in something more. Made me want to believe in crazy ideas like faith, hope, and love. Now, I gotta tell you, I still battle with my demons, and in fact, last night I drank way too much. And even today, as I was getting ready, I was like, gosh, I'm gonna talk about God, and here I was getting drunk last night, and I'm just such a contradiction. I'm a liar, I'm a hypocrite. But in times like this, I like to remember Andrés' words. He picked me up to take me to one of Daniel's plays that was being performed in Modesto. I think it was called Bilingual Productions. And I remember on the drive, he had his 2 uncooked turkeys on the steering wheel. And he looked over at me and he said, so have you been writing? And I told him, no, I didn't have anything to say. I was going through so much in my life, I thought it would be absurd of me to write when I don't know anything. And he said, he looked at me and he went, shh. He goes, that's a lie from the devil. We all got something to say. And like I said, The Cholo Who Said Nothing was published last year. It's a good book. It's okay. It's all right. But if you look inside, you'll see the things I've stolen from Andrés. You'll hear his words. You'll hear his faith. You'll see the Jesus and the social justice that he was always striving for. The love that, honestly, I think he died for. Andrés' writing has been a mighty blessing in my life, and it's apparent from all of you that it's been one in yours as well. Thank you.
always feel like you make me want to cry thinking about it, but I won't cry. I was there in Washington, D.C. watching the panel, and I was thinking about a lot about that when people were talking today about the panel and how emotional, how on the surface everything, and not in a bad way, on the surface our emotions were, and people just crying, sitting next to each other and holding hands, and I thought about that. It brought back a lot of that. But I'm going to talk. I'm Marisol. I'm going to talk a little bit about, first, to tell the story of how I met Andrés. Then I'll talk a little bit about how his work has influenced me. But I think I want to tell it every single time I'm speaking for an event that celebrates him. And that was, I was around 16, 17 years old, and I just had a poem published through Qua. At the very, I think it was one of the very first issues, and I was a high school student. I was a senior, and I was a senior at Bullard High School, so talk about a weird world to be coming from, but I was writing all these poems, and I was reading poems and thinking about it, and I hadn't met Andrés Montoya, or anyone pretty much, yet, and I went to, I think it was my first poetry reading where I read, and I was going to read the poem that was published in Flies, Cockroaches, and Poets, and I think it was called The Jaguar God, and I dressed up with my idea or my thought about what you would dress up for a poetry reading, because I don't think I had really been to any. And it was at Barnes & Noble, the old Barnes & Noble in Fresno that had the little, like, kind of terrace upstairs. And I think Andrés had been maybe thrown out of there a few times already, and I'd never met him, and I went upstairs, and he came up to me and said hello, and you'll read right after me. And I was wearing this lavender dress, and it was like crepe material, and I had pantyhose on, and it was a Sunday school dress, no, not Sunday school, but a church dress, and I had my one poem, and I was so nervous to read, and he read before me, and obviously it was brought up earlier that Andrés would get up and he would put his hands up, but not only did he do that for his reading, he got up, he stood up, he put his hands out, and then he went prostrate on the floor and looked up at the sky and said, "Jesus Christ, why have you forsaken me?" But he didn't say it like that, he screamed it. Screamed it so loud. And there were probably like 4 people, and probably like my parents were in, watching it. And I realized I was just dressed the wrong way. And I had to go after him. But one of the things that Andrés did was he kind of taught me at that moment that you have to be courageous and you have to speak your truth no matter what. And so I did. I went up right after him, and I was, with the pájaros in my voice and the, shaking, and I read Jaguar God, the Jaguar God, and I got some claps, and that was really amazing. And that was my entry into reading poetry out loud for people, and what an amazing gift to come after that reading and to come after such an amazing poet. Andrés was also the first person he introduced me to Lorna D. Cervantes' work when I was that young, and he was older. He was a mentor to me. I didn't know him as a peer. I knew him as a mentor, someone larger than life, obviously larger than life, a big man, but also a presence that was large. So Andrés' work and his spirit were what brought me and a few of his best friends and family together over the years, and that was one of the gifts that he also gave me. These friendships have encouraged me, inspired me through countless times during my journey as a writer. Andrés was a generous person. When I knew him in that way. I read with him many times after that. I sat and I talked with him about poetry at Fresno City College and at the Review. I was young and I would just listen to what he had to say and then ask him a million questions, especially near that large fountain at Fresno City College where I teach now. I asked him the big questions about art and poetry, and somehow I wasn't intimidated by him. I felt like he would listen, and he did. He always spent time talking with me and seeing me when others did not. Sometimes they treated me like a child, right? And I was a girl, I was a young woman, so I got treated like a child a lot. But he didn't treat me like a kid. He saw potential. And when he passed, those who were close to him took up that role and helped me in that same generous spirit. I remember reaching out to Danielle, when I moved back to California, and I was searching for a kindred spirit because New York felt really far away and strange, and I was coming back. And that's when I was invited to speak at for Pákatelas. And I think I was maybe there were only 2 women reading there, and I was one of the only ones, and the other was Teresa, and she came in a little later with the babies, I think a baby in her arms, and but it was a welcoming back into a community, and it was brought up earlier, I think by Cynthia, about this feeling of not belonging, of being an outsider maybe, and I think Andrés was not about, he was about making people feel like they were included, even if he was critical of their work. I promise I'm not crying, it's just my voice is nervous. But he was inclusive, and it was important for him to treat people like they mattered. And when he just talked to you like you were the only person in the room. That was pretty important to me. So, because of this, he suggested that I go into QA, that I was a part of QA. I think I was a secretary for QA back in the day, and I met some of my best friends through writing there. And as a result of his encouragement, I became close to those friends, and that's meant a lot to me in my writing. I won the Andrés Montoya Poetry Scholarship at Fresno State twice. And that money paid for books. And one of the books that I remember buying with that money was Poeta Nuevo York, which is Lorca's book. And it was the first time I ever read Lorca in that way. And I had read Lorca before, but it was that book that was very important to me when I was writing. I watched as amazing writers won his first book prize. And these voices are were celebrated here last night, were impacted by his special light and his time on earth. I live in places that Andrés lived and walked, and I do right now. I live in the center of the city, and I can't help but to see every single day the Fresno that speaks of him in his poems. And many parts make so much sense to me now that I'm older and I can see this. I can't help to see the influence in my writing. And I live a block and a half from Radio Park. I walk there with my dogs. My streets are Clinton and Blackstone. The highway is a veranda which cuts through everything above me. That's where my house is. I sit and I talk to students on the benches where he sat and he talked to me. I walk home through the neighborhoods that are both rich with children and grandmas and elote and popsicle syrup and drug deals and exposed guns, the sounds of gunshots every night. And over it, all the ambulances screaming past me, the helicopters circling overhead, and sometimes so close that I can almost touch their little metal bellies. And I walk into Scotty's to grab a drink, or I enjoy the sun coming through the lace-bark elms at FCC, and I think about him asking, have I been writing? And telling me that he has been writing, and making sure that I'm writing, always writing, reading, but writing, writing, writing. No pretense, no politicking, no grabbing for attention, just curiosity and a need to get his message, redemption, Christ, poetry out. He treated me like an equal, Andrés. And in this way, he was constantly questioning, and his curious nature and love of language was infectious to me, and I caught it. And in my own work, at least in Tremor, the poems are about landscape. They're about a home for me that doesn't exist anymore. I can never go back. They're about articulating pain, which is almost impossible to articulate. And I go back to Andrés's work, and I've done so many times, to remind myself how to stay true to a place, to ask myself, what am I trying to say about this landscape, about this pain? I'm not going to romanticize it. Andrés wouldn't. He didn't. And when he wrote this truth and most of those truths as ugly and painful, but with light at the end. And this is an important lesson, not only one that Andrés and his work influenced in me. His loss was immense, but through his attendance in life and art, a community has grown up. People taking his message and working with it and being active and attentive with other people's lives and other people's creativity, and working all of that into some kind of light, and it continues. I'm thankful for it.
Thank you. It's kind of weird when I was invited to speak on this panel, because the idea of, how do you speak about the influence of somebody that, you were in the time with that person, I think that Andrés and I were probably dipping our creative ladles into the same pond at the same time, or the same ponds at the same time. He wasn't published. I mean, he didn't have his book at the time. I just knew him as a young writer like myself, a little bit older than me, in fact, but somebody who knew, and had known for quite some time that he wanted to write, that's what he was doing by the time I met him. I had just come into the realization, I was like 20 years old, that I was probably going to pursue writing in a serious way. And now, I'm from Visalia, which is about an hour south of Fresno. I'm not from Fresno. The only reason I was coming to Fresno in the mid-90s was in search of Juan Felipe Herrera. I was coming here because I'd seen him on a PBS special late one night in Visalia, and I was like, I teach at Fresno State. I'm going to go hang out around Fresno State. So I did for a couple of years. I hung around Fresno State. I would just go hang around the campus. People would see me, I start to know people at the fountain. Say, hey, you come here? I'm like, I come here all the time. Yeah. Yeah, I come here all the time. And then my friend, the muralist Ramiro Martinez, I had just met Ramiro also, and he said to me, hey Tim, do you want to come and read some of your poems in Chinatown? Now, mind you, I was driving almost every day to Fresno just to be around other artists, because in Visalia I didn't know any other writers or artists. So I was driving here almost every day. And Ramiro says, do you want to come and do this reading in Chinatown? It's a place called Centro Bellas Artes. And I said, yeah, I'd love to. Well, Ramiro had been collaborating with another visual artist, Ramsés Noriega. And Ramsés was, hanging around, Andrés was hanging around Ramsés quite a bit during those years. So Ramiro and Ramsés were putting this art exhibit together that I was supposed to read at. I was invited to by Ramiro, and Ramsés had invited Andrés to read. So we were the only two that read together that day at this art exhibit, where there was like four of us, and I think my parents were there, and John Martinez was probably there also. A few people were there, and anyway, so Andrés and I read that night. And I remember thinking, and we had a long conversation afterwards, there was wine, things like that there, and I started to get to know him then. Now, one of the things that struck me from that moment, and then of course afterwards, I was still seeing him around Fresno, and Mike Medrano and I started hanging out, and we started hanging around Juan Felipe. Finally I found him, and I was being in his office there at Fresno State. During that time, Andrés to me struck me as a holy roller. I was like, this guy is like serious about Christ, forget that. I'm about the revolution. I'm with Kenny, except without the gun. But I was like, so that's kind of where I was at in my head at the time, thinking, I was reading Ricardo Sanchez, I was reading, I was listening to Gil Scott-Heron, and reading Amiri Baraka, and I was like, revolution, and then I would go and read with Andrés somewhere, and then he'd be talking about Christ, and I was like, Christ, this guy. And every time I saw him, he was hanging around at Ramses, and this was Silvia Torres, a wonderful artist and human being also, and Hugo Manriquez, and all these folks, and I used to just imagine them having poetry readings and then / prayer circles. That's how I imagined them in my mind, and then we started hanging around Marisol and Mike Quintana. I felt like I was part of the heathens, and Andrés was like, they were saved, and we would see each other, from across the campus or something. The campus I didn't go to. I was hanging out with these guys close enough, but then we'd have poetry readings at Barnes and Noble and all that, and then we'd all get to hang out, and it was wonderful. But I'll never forget this one moment where it all comes down to for me. He always had these kind of questions for me. He would probe about my writing and stuff, and I always wasn't sure if he was pulling my leg, if he was just trying to mess with me, or if he was being serious, And so one time I saw him at Barnes, it was at Borders, which is now an H&M, whatever. Anyway, in River Park, it was Borders at the time. And I saw him there, shuffling through CDs, and he says, how's the writing coming along? And I said, it's coming along really good. He says, hey, let me ask you something. I go, what? He was like, what's your purpose, bro? That's what he said, what's your purpose, bro? He's like that. So what's your purpose, bro? And he was really tall to me. And I just remember his face and kind of leaned, what's your purpose, bro? I went, what? What do you mean my purpose? Like, yeah, who do you write for? And I said, well, I write for La Raza, dude. I write for the people, I was like, I write poems of revolution. I write, I want change. That's what I write. I was like, well, who do you write for? I asked him, and he just looked at me square in the eye and said, I write for God. And I went, yeah, I could have guessed that. I didn't say that. I didn't have the guts to say it on face at the time, but I was thinking that. I could have guessed that. I write for God. He looked at me and said, I write for God. And then, we continued on, just having this kind of a relationship, seeing our readings and all of that. And then when his book of poetry came out, after he passed away, and I opened it up, every other poem has the word Christ in it. And I still kind of almost shrugged it off at the time, but I knew one thing, and that was that Andrés was unwavering from that, which is nothing you haven't heard in this symposium. He was unwavering from that, but unapologetically Christian, unapologetically, putting the word Christ in his poems. Now, it's taken me 6 books later, this was when I was hanging around Andrés, it was 1995, 96, 97, until his death, 99. And then my first book was published in 2004. And now, 6 books later, and just this last book, I've been going around the country, people ask me, what's the purpose? And I realize that my purpose is I write for God, which is to say love, just to say the human spirit, And I find myself saying that more and more everywhere I go, and I go, holy shit. Andrés knew that way back before even his first book was published. He knew that. I don't know if that was any kind of direct influence, but I want to think that there was a seed planted. And in the process of the last 20 years, I have just come to that place. And I think about Andrés now and his poetry now because of that. In fact, I'm going to conclude with this last memory I have of Andrés. The last reading I ever saw him was at Fresno State. We're at Fresno State, yeah. Okay, the University Pit, the free speech area right out here. And he had just found out that he was sick. And it was Mike Medrano and myself sitting outside. I don't know what the event was. Is Mike here? No, okay. All right, we're gonna call him on that. It was Mike Medrano and I outside, and Andrés went to read. And as Marisol said, Andrés would always, he shouted a lot of things during some of his readings. But in this moment, Mike and I sat there and watched him, and he just learned, we knew that Andrés had just learned that he was sick, and he still had his ponytail, he was still, the Andrés that I remember, and he stood there, and then he called out to God, he screamed to God. And so it moved me, and I wrote this poem like that. Probably within that week, I wrote this poem, and it was published in my book Skin Text. I'm going to read that. When young Andrés died, before his book came out, not a poet in town could find the words. Tongues hung out to dry like raisins, out like burning flags, gagging tears of ash, fire and smoke, weeping smudge stacks in the big sky, holding hands as we did in the cavity of church, where we gathered for the juice like ants on a gutted grape. His voice tilling, tender and desperate, at every reading, praying poets find pulp in poems, when he sang, when he loved, when he cried out. God! In the university pit, books clapped shut, ravens dreaded, tree limbs and rooftops, eyes yanked. From lovers' gates, students snapped their pencils, smeared ink, blinked and listened. In fertile soil, amid the orchards, the dust and sweat where crows clamor and swarm in clouds, where summer ghosts rise from asphalt off Highway 99. I still imagine your voice, Andrés, in the warm baritone of earth, reciting ice worker hymns to seedlings, not yet touching sky, lulling the roots of trees, peaches, plum and figs, that will one day ripen to a plump sweetness, nourishing our hunger, the fruit of our lives as you've known it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can we have one more round of applause for all of them? And we have time for questions, please. Or comments.
Could you hear him in the back?
For the sake of a little segue into the questions, these unexpected emotional moments as each person was reading, but when Tim read that poem and that exaltation, I almost started to, almost began to weep, thinking how much Andrés would have loved that. Not just the poem, but what and how, you know, but wonderful. Are there questions? Yes.
I never knew Andrés personally, born in '96, but it sounds like he was struggled a lot with his own problems and demons that he has to mention. He was this revolutionary, and pardon the metaphor, but he was a revolutionary who had fire. And the problem I have is, how do you have fire, be a revolutionary, dislike the civilization built on the backs of evil, and not burn it all down? And that's a good read of it once.
That's a good question. That's to the panelists.
I'm not sure I understood the question. I'm sorry.
So how do we not burn it down?
Yeah. Like, how do you have all of that anger and pain, not inflict anger and pain, but pretend to create something more, even if you are telling about it?
I don't know, maybe I can speak for myself, but you know, what I've learned is that anger and pain is, it can be an addiction just like anything else, and that when you give into into your anger, or when you give into your pain, your guilt, or whatever it is, your rage, that it becomes a high, and you have to keep doing it. You have to keep, and it has to get worse and worse, and you know, like the image of me punching the drawer, you know, it leaves things worse than they were. And so instead of like tearing down, instead of burning down, it's about building, you know, with the careful precision that love requires.
And maybe a part of it is that crying out, is that escape for a moment from like structure and, you know, the poem writing, you know, and the craft and all of that is the calling out, is the, you know, the moment where the sound just, it shatters everything, and it should shatter everything, and it does, and it has to come out, and maybe it does a little bit without us even wanting it to, you know, but trying to grab that moment and, you know, use it in a really good way, in a positive way. Maybe trying to learn how to do that. Maybe that's about having courage and all of that. I think he definitely did.
Others? Yes, and then yes. Sarah?
So all day today, I mean, so many wonderful things have been said, and a lot of it in terms of his work has been about the content and his, again, his delivery and his presence. And I was wondering, if you all could talk a little bit to his sort of like craft influence, like in terms of the artistry of the work, like how have you engaged with that, or how has that spoken to you, or has it shown in your own work?
I'll answer that. So in my book that's coming out next year, I was really like invested in place and what like place means in Fresno, and I'm really interested in how geography has worked in my life. And so I realized when I was like starting to write it, I realized I had all my happy memories happening in Parkside, Fresno. And I was like, oh, it was because that was where I lived with my parents before my parents split up and my dad left town and he moved away. And so I think that manuscript was a lot about me writing back all these places, like back to life, right? And so the characters are like zigzagging across Fresno. And so, like, for example, I write about pizza and pipes. I write about, how it was really weird that there was a drive-in right next door to a race car track, right? And so, yeah, I think I was always really taken by place and how Montoya was so, like, connected to place. And so I try to, I think, like, because I'm a fiction writer, so I think for me it's very important to, like, focus on characters and desire first. And so I was thinking about, like, how is my desire connected to all these, like, places that I long for that are no longer around, and that are still around, but they're, like, manifested in different ways.
Anybody else want to speak to that?
I was actually in a conversation with the poet Lauren Guerrero about some of Andres' work. You know, because again, as I mentioned, this idea of our sort of creative ladles and these similar ponds, you know, I know one of the people that had a lot of influence, at least at the time, from what I could see, as far as I could see, was the poetry of Omar Salinas, you know. And in fact, you could read, you know, you can read an Andres poem and see Omar in it, and then you can read one of mine also and see Omar and Andres in it. You know, it was like, but Larry Levis, a lot of the sort of local Fresno and you know, this Fresno, this Central Valley poets and writers, to me, when I read Andres, especially when I read Ice Worker Sings, I should be specific. When I read the Ice Worker Sings, I see all of them inside of this book in a very deliberate way, you know, in a way that not only stole but also honored, you know. And one of the things that I've always loved about Andres' poetry, and this is where I find him most alive in his poetry too, is in this kind of a you know, that he kind of has this essence of the coyote trickster, you know, the trickster in Andres, which was, you know, I could never take him serious as a writer, but I could always take him sincere as a writer. There was a difference. And so, he was that way in person when he would, like I said, I wasn't sure sometimes he was pulling my leg or not, or a little bit of both. And even in the same way that he introduces the idea of beauty inside of the found in the ugliness, not that they are two different things, but in fact they are one thing. Beauty is ugliness, ugliness is the beauty. These are the sort of ongoing themes that I find in some of the writers that I know I was reading at the time, and from what I'm vaguely familiar with, Andrés was also interested in too, and I find in his poems.
So, a friend asked me to ask you all this question. A friend from Central New York who's in love with Andrés Montoya, his poetry. He's of the opinion, I strongly disagree, but I thought I'd ask you all, that all poets really poetry their lives to kind of get, the juice out of whatever they can in their lives in terms of their poetry. And I was wondering if that's what you think about that in terms of an ethical question, kind of in line a little bit with what you were saying earlier, Gabriel. Maybe poaching, maybe not. How do you poach maybe from your own life? Where are those lines for you? What do you not talk about? Or what is sort of sacred or that you don't decide not to put poetry in your poetry? And how's that true or not for this part?
Well, I was thinking about when you said bringing the juice out of the life. I would definitely not want to drink the juice that ice worker sings. I think it's not juice at all. There's a lot of piss and grit and unmentionable types of things in it, right? But it gives one the allowance to write about those things, and that I think maybe uncomfortableness to be able to write about those things is something that is hard for me to do, but essential. And I would say, not that I know of right now, is there something that I'm not writing about? Tackling it, but things that are difficult. But yeah, no, I think there's definitely an allowance of these are the things that you should write about, and walking around and what you actually smell rather than what you would like it to smell like. Hard to do, but probably there's an allowance there that he's given.
Anybody else want to speak to that?
I don't think that, this is interesting because my assessment, as I was reading the Ice Worker Sings and reading The Jury of Trees, in Ice Worker Sings, Andrés does he creates a lot of portraits of people in the community and all that, it's very kind of almost external, and yet it could also be a portrait of self constantly, right? But he's looking at, sort of the external world around him often, most often, not always, but most often. And The Jury of Trees, obviously it's his earlier work and all of that, but then at the very end, when you find those poems he wrote when he was already sick, you start to find very deep introspection suddenly, I can't answer because I didn't speak to Andrés in those final days, and I didn't know him to the level of intimacy that his friends here knew him. But for me personally, there's no area that is a sacred cow in sort of my own emotional landscape. It's all up for grabs, all of it. The thing is that sometimes it's not ready to be out yet, and it still takes time for me to process and figure out and work through. But I know it's going to come out. It's a matter of when. And Andrés, to his only book that he knew was going to be a book that was not published posthumously. He was the young poet, and like I said, it took me 6 books to get to. He was already doing that prior to his first book, and I can't just imagine what he would have been writing right now, Yeah, that's all I'll offer to that.
So I just want to thank all of you. All of your readings were very moving, and I guess as we kind of end the panel session of the symposium, I just want to pose the question. Each time we have these kinds of events, and there's been at AWP, we had a book release in Elmira in this last September. going all the way back to when we had the In the Grove release, and that was 10 years ago, was, you know, this excavation. It's a story that we share, and all of it's very, you know, very important, and it's wonderful and joyous to hear the stories, but it's also, you know, it's emotional and draining, and all of, you know, just so many feelings, so many emotions, and in some sense I feel like we've been working towards this symposium for at least 10 years, right? You know, Dan Chacón and Francisco Aragón, you know, their discussions may have predated it, but I guess the question is, like, what do we do now, right? The book is out, right? Daniel has, you know, said, you know, this book represents the best that Andrés produced in what remained of his work. And then, you know, we're working after the book came out towards this symposium, pulling all together these different writers and these different artists and people who knew Andrés to come together. And, you know, I'm not saying we need to have, you know, any answers or a plan in no way, but just, well, I don't know. And so I'm asking, what is your sense as far as how we move forward with Andrés' work and Andrés' memory? Start with
You know, one of the things that, this is not an answer, but one of the things is, you know, I mean, obviously, I think all of us are, it's safe to say probably for all of us that we're an extension of Andrés' own sort of spirit, and the work we do is very much a ripple from that, from his life. But one of the things that strikes me is, and this happens, you know, often, is that when one of our own passes, you know, then we are, you know, we are inspired to do these things, and I think that, you know, and I think all of us, probably most of us here, at least that I know personally, are doing things already while we're here, you know, while we are here in this time, and I think that's probably the most important for me. The most important takeaway is that, you know, each of us have this platform. You know, all of us. I mean, this room is filled with so much talent. You know, we all have this platform, and we are all able to do and give a little bit in the way that this symposium has hopefully rippled out, in the way that actually all the events, as you mentioned, in the last 10 years, I can't believe it's been 10 years, but 10 years since In the Grove, you know, I think that that we all continue to do that work and to find ways in which we can, you know, continue this kind of work. By this work, I mean specifically these exchanges and these conversations that go beyond Fresno State campus, that go out into, you know, West Fresno, and they go out into, you know, Fowler and further out, you know, out into the world. So I think particularly in the way that Andrés looked to the creases and the folds and the margins of society for inspiration, that's where it would be good for us to go into those places, those societies, those communities to do that kind of work, you know, to look where we've been overlooking.
And I think more than anything, you know, the way that I see it is, you know, that you know, what would Andrés say? What would Jesus do? What would Andrés do? And I think he would just say, "Are you writing?" You know, and I think that's what he would want us all to do, is write. And for the next Andrés Montoya, you know, for the next writer who's going to come out and who's going to just touch people in such a special way, you know, plant those seeds. Like, we're gonna sing our songs, but we've also got to help others find their voices. At least that's what I think, because that's what he would have done.
Yeah, I think I spoke a little bit about mentorship when I was talking earlier, and I think that's the legacy is, you know, it's important to acknowledge the work of the people that are coming, that are working right now, and to see people as, even if they're young and they're working, but to see them as having potential. And I think we do that. I think that's, you know, active and going on, and it spreads far beyond Fresno State or the campus or even Fresno. But I think mentorship is probably one of the most important things, and having and keeping your eye out for people. And I think I mean I see that, you know, with you obviously, everyone that's here, you know, has been, I mean, everybody that I'm sitting around is actively doing that, and that's mentorship, and it's, I think, a very true way. That's definitely something that he, I think, would have liked.
I just want to add a really short note, Maceo. I absolutely agree. You know, mentoring is vital, and I think also this has been said, and maybe it's obvious, but the importance of teaching the books and reading the books, and his two, but also the books that are branched off from that, Letters to the Poet from His Brother, and of course all the prize winners. And that's what I wanted to say also in terms of the next so many years is, to the extent anyone can, supporting the organizations that with the book prize, the Institute for Latino Studies and the work at Notre Dame through Francisco, and building more organizations that can support his work and the work of others. Yes. A few more minutes for another question, and if so.